Hello, everyone. A very good morning to all of you. Hope you all are well and keeping safe. I think what a beautiful day today. So we welcome you, a warm welcome to all of you to the India Center seminar. I mean, we know that this time is not the right time, but we have to really find some ways to really promote some of the fascinating research that our colleagues are doing. So as you've seen that from the introduction clip, there are many more very interesting and high-profile and fascinating seminars and distinguished lectures coming to you. But I also know that some of you are actually joining us from from outside Southampton. So to all of those who have joined from other places, even from other countries, a warm welcome. So today we have Dr. Utsa Mukherjee, who recently joined University of Southampton as a postdoctoral, as an ESRC, the Economic, Social and Research Council postdoctoral fellow position. So prior to joining Southampton, Utsa was at the Birkbeck University of London and then also at the University of Roehampton. So Utsa also conducted fascinating field studies, field research, both in the UK and India. And his research interest is broadly in the area of sociology of childhood, which is really fascinating. I always really get fascinated by the childhood, how childhood develops into and its impact on later life and so on. Also, he has worked on social inequalities, leisure, race and ethnicity, and post-colonial studies. So as part of his postdoctoral research, Utsa will be working on a monograph on race, class, and children's leisure, along with our dear Professor Rosalind Edwards. There's also fascinating opportunity here for many of you to really, join hands for collaborative research with Utsa. But without taking further ado, I think I'll just hand it over to Utsa. Utsa, you have the floor, so you may take up to 35 to 40 minutes, and then we will open the platform for question and answers. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for the generous introduction, Sabu, and also thanks to Joe for setting this up. So what I thought I'll do today is give a sense of the kind of research that I've been involved in recently and what I'll be doing as part of my postdoctoral fellowship. So can everybody see?
Yeah, we can see the slides, and also Utsa, I think it would be helpful if you could sort of come closer to the microphone, because I mean we can hear you, but it's just yeah. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay now, or is the audio still muffled?
We can hear you. That's fine.
Great. So yeah, as I was saying, so today, in the course of the talk, I'll be going through various aspects of my work. So I'll start off, I thought, by introducing some of the terms, some of the concepts that I work with around Indian diaspora and trying to understand processes of social identity and inequality in that context. And then I'll move on to the more substantive work around leisure and parenting culture that I have been involved with for some time now. So, and if there's any problem with the audio or anything like that, do let me know. I can try and see what's going wrong and take it from there. Anyways, without much ado, let me get into the talk and start at the very beginning by laying down some of the concepts around leisure that I use and also around diaspora. So the word diaspora really has become prominent in academic discourse quite recently as a way of thinking about and understanding movement, subjectivity, and belonging that transcend national borders. It originates in the context of Greeks and Jews' dispersal from their respective homelands, but it has now been repurposed and broadened as a metaphoric designation for several categories of migrant population in today's world. And since diasporic lives connect places, cultures, and networks across multiple geographies, it is a useful lens for interrogating transnational formations and the changing ethnic and racial composition of contemporary societies like the United Kingdom and the United States. In using diaspora as a framework, we need to be conscious of both the historical context of migration and settlement, and in doing so, pay attention to questions of homeland, both real and imagined, how diasporans engage with the homeland, as well as how they actively shape the economic, cultural, and political landscape of their countries of settlement. And these arguments really direct our attention to the diasporic present or diaspora spaces, where reified conceptions of border and cultural identities are contested and remade. And indeed, sort of something that Stuart Hall really brings out is the idea that cultural identities in the diaspora have histories. They come from somewhere and they go somewhere. And therefore, they undergo constant transformation in the place of settlement. So understanding these historical processes go hand in hand with an appreciation of how cultural identities are refashioned and constructed in the present from resources that are available to diasporans in the here and now. And also how they play out within the internal fissures of class, gender, generation, and so on of these diasporic formations. So in other words, to use Claire Alexander's formulation, diaspora constitutes a field of interaction which is internally differentiated and externally porous. And in this paper and in my research, I take up the case of the Indian diaspora and the Indian diaspora in the UK more specifically to explore the link between leisure practices and cultural identities. While, of course, while talking about the Indian diasporic community and any diasporic community for that matter, one needs to be quite conscious of the pitfalls inherent in such usage. Because there's a certain ambivalence built into the term diaspora, which can be exploited either to reify cultural identities, erase internal structural inequalities, and mount reactionary nationalist projects like the one being mounted by the current dispensation in India, while at the same time, the concept of diaspora can be mobilized as a springboard to challenge, unsettle, or subvert those very tendencies. So in trying to frame my debate around Indian diaspora, I'll be engaging with this question of ambivalence that is built into the notion of the diaspora. Now, scholars of Indian diaspora, especially historians, often draw a distinction between waves of outmigration from India that took place in the kind of pre-colonial and colonial India and those that took place post-independence in the 20th century. So my focus, my work is around post-colonial diasporas, which formed in the UK post-1950s. Now, roughly speaking, the global Indian diaspora now stands at around 30 million, and this is an estimate that the Overseas Indian Affairs unit of the government of India has come up with. And many of these diasporans contribute to the Indian economy through remittances, for example, and in 2019, it was to the tune of 78.6 billion a year, USD a year. So making India one of the highest recipients of remittances in the world. And consequently, the government of India has invested heavily in the last 2 decades in erecting infrastructures of engagement with the global diaspora as an instrument of its foreign policy, trying to tap into the economic and political clout of the diasporans. And in policy terms, this has involved various kinds of initiatives, such as the one around the issuance of overseas Indian citizenship cards, and also the inauguration of the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas, or the Overseas Indians Day in 2003, which has continued since, and also 2006, a scholarship program was introduced for diaspora children, which is meant to support Indian youth across the diaspora to go back to India to study in Indian higher education institutes. So this measures go on to show the growing significance of the diaspora in the Indian Indian popular imagination and in policy circles. Now, to think specifically about the Indian diaspora in the UK, it is quite a sizable population of 2.5% of the population of England and Wales, making up roughly 1.4 million people. And there has been a huge growth in this number. So during the kind of in between First and Second World War, the number of Indians in the UK was around 5,000 to 8,000. In 1951, it rose to 31,000, and now in the latest census of 2011 puts that number at 1.4 million. So these demographic changes in terms of the Indian presence in the UK reflects the kind of the changing landscape of immigration laws, the global market forces, as well as some of the policies around immigration that's part of the British domestic politics. One way of looking at the Indian diaspora is to see in the UK is to look at it as comprising of three main groups, really. So one are the descendants of those who migrated to the UK in the post-Second World War years, and who are now part of the multi-generational diasporic communities within the UK. And you can see the several pockets of this multi-generational diasporas in parts of London, Birmingham, Leicester, and so forth. Second, there are Indian transmigrants who moved to the UK in the last 2 decades, around kind of the Blair years, and later through kind of skilled visa routes, and many of whom have now taken up British citizenship. And this is a particularly middle-class professional group. The third is a kind of ensemble of UK visa-holding Indian citizens who study, work, or live here without having British citizenship rights. So these are the kind of groups that my research dealt with. And in this kind of, in studying these diasporic groups in the UK, some of the existing research has looked at questions of cultural identities, how transnational family practices are undertaken within this context, how religion is practiced, or experiences of racism among some of the prominent themes that have come up in this research. When it comes to questions of cultural identities, a lot of attention has been given to material cultural products, including fashion, food, media, films, literature, which are often mobilized and kind of by diasporic Indians for sculpting their cultural identity. But in all of this literature, children are conspicuously absent. And more specifically, what I'm interested in is the kind of social constructions of childhood, how ideas of childhood as imbricated in diasporic cultural politics. And this particular kind of link between childhood and diasporic cultural politics is often not engaged with in much of the Indian diaspora studies literature. And I do see a kind of adult-centric tendency in much of this research where this kind of ideas of childhood and how childhood figures in the kind of in the entire discourse of diaspora is absent, and so are the voices of actual children and the way they live their lives. And this is where my project comes in, which seeks to unpack Indian diasporic children's leisure experiences and their leisure geographies to think about as a kind of point of entry for thinking about identity, and also about how cultural identities, cultural heritage is kind of passed on across generations in the diaspora. So one might ask, why leisure, and why should leisure be the point of entry? Because it hasn't really been the point of entry for most research on Indian diaspora, let alone research on Indian diasporic childhoods. And I think leisure is particularly important and pertinent to these questions because there are certain shifts that are currently taking place within children's everyday time that I think makes leisure a particularly important site. So firstly, if you look at kind of large-scale time use studies in the UK around children's time use, one sees a particular shift in how children use their after-school hours. The school time is more or less demarcated, but what happens outside of school? Now, most children are now spending a large chunk of their after-school hours in adult supervised organized leisure activities or in kind of home-based, screen-based leisure. And as a result, there's been a decline in unsupervised outdoor play. So these shifts are quite telling because they reveal a particular dominance, a particular kind of parenting strategy, where middle-class parents are spending a huge amount of their time and money in sending their children to these organized leisure activities. And they do so with the hope of shaping their future outcomes. By that I mean leisure activities, these leisure lessons outside of school are seen as spaces through which children can learn certain number of soft skills, can build new networks, all of which can then help them later at university and also further on in their career. So while we talk a lot about education and school education as a site where sort of social inequalities are reproduced, how parents invest in educational resources for children as a way of cornering social advantages, we often do not talk about leisure, but leisure is one of those kind of areas of children's lives where inequalities get reproduced by the simple fact that middle-class parents spend a lot of money and time in sending children to these leisure lessons where they learn all the skills, while working-class parents, for obvious reasons, do not send their children in as many of these kind of leisure lessons. And as a result, those gaps really widen later on. So while we know a lot about these class-based differences in leisure parenting, how race and ethnicity plays out is less well understood. And this is where my study comes in, because most of the research around children's changing leisure geographies, this idea of middle-class leisure-based parenting, really talks about white middle-class parents in the UK. And my study is one of the first kind of full-length work to look into minority ethnic middle-class parenting strategies, and to see the kind of narratives that parents galvanize in thinking about children's leisure options. So in terms of the research, I look at leisure in three main aspects, and I call them genres of children's leisure. So this includes things like structured leisure lessons that children participate in. These are organized and adult supervised. The second group of leisure I look at is family leisure, which are cross-generational collective leisure activities undertaken both within the home as well as outside, but as a family unit. And third, I look at casual leisure, so more unstructured leisure that children participate in, and this often includes forms of digital leisure. And this particular framework of leisure is, I think, quite useful in thinking about how each particular kind of leisure interact with the other, and the various kinds of valuation that is placed by children and parents on each kind of leisure. So this is a rough framework I use in my research to think about the narratives that parents and children associate with leisure, and the role that leisure plays in children's and parents' everyday life. So the project was, as I said, was really about understanding children's leisurescapes and in understanding leisure-based parenting strategies in middle-class British Indian families. So 10 middle-class Indian diasporic families living in and around London took part in my research. So this is the research that I undertook as part of my PhD, which I completed earlier this year from Royal Holloway University of London. And currently I am building on this project for the monograph that Sabu talked about. So these 10 families were all, and by middle-class Indian diasporic families, I mean the parents in these families were all university educated, they were homeowners, and they, barring 4 housewives, they were all employed in professional capacities in industries like telecommunications, IT, software, medicine, and education. So these were highly qualified, high-earning, home-owning, middle-class parents living in and around London. And the children that were involved in the study were between the ages 8 and 12. So what I did in terms of collecting my data was to conduct semi-structured interviews with parents and children. So have one-to-one semi-structured interviews with parents, and then semi-structured one-to-one interviews with children. But also with children, I used a drawing activity which involved children drawing, making sort of drawings about their family leisure experiences, and then talking me through those drawings, which I then used as a form of sort of the drawing exercise became a data elicitation tool to gather really rich data about children's experiences of leisure. Now, there are two particular aspects of everyday leisure of children that I'm going to, children as well as families, that I'm going to talk about today. One is around how cultural identities really are reproduced through leisure in these families. And the second is around placemaking. So I'll talk about each in turn. So as you can see here, I have got a few excerpts from my interviews with parents and children about certain ethnic leisure practices which are prevalent in these families. So the Indian diasporic parents who took part in my study expressed a latent anxiety about the need to ensure that the children grow up with an appreciation for their Indian heritage and develop positive ethnic identity. Although previous studies have hinted at these parental concerns around cultural transmission, they have not unpacked the manner in which Indian diasporic parents activate certain strategies and non-physical forms of heritage to affect these forms of cultural reproduction in the diaspora. Now, in the participating families, the parents mobilize children's leisure spaces to channel those cultural heritage that they deem to be an integral part of their transnational Indian identity. So these leisure spaces included children's organized activities, but also included cross-generational family leisure. So, as you can see in the first quote, which is from Ashka, 9-year-old girl, her parents were both born in the UK in kind of Gujarati families. And she now participates in Bollywood dancing. So she says, my mom booked me for Bollywood dancing. So she really wanted me to dance more than play the piano. So I stopped the piano and did Bollywood dancing. And Bollywood dancing and Bollywood films record through the interviews as one of those readily available options that parents often mobilize in order to get their children some sense of their Indian music and Indian dance forms. Similarly, Paramjit, who grew up in the UK and has 2 children, aged 10 and 12, she talks about Punjabi language lessons that she has arranged for her daughter to take. And she says Punjabi language is a nice skill to have because they can speak with the family. In this language class, they not only learn about the Punjabi language, but also about the culture, the Sikh history. But one thing to note in this is some diasporas, like the Punjabi and the Gujarati diasporas in the UK, have longer history of presence. And as a result, some of this infrastructure around ethnic leisure spaces have really kind of proliferated. So it is things like Bollywood dancing and some language lessons like Gujarati or Punjabi are more readily available than others. And therefore, these parents have that option, and because they live in and around London, they have the option of sending their children to these lessons. On the other hand, some of the new diasporas who do not have that kind of historical presence in the UK, and the numbers have really grown recently, those options are not readily available. For example, Mahesh, who is originally from Kerala, grew up in Delhi and came to the UK around 15 to 20 years ago for his work. So his daughter was born in the UK and has grown up here. And he talks about the tradition in his family of sending the girl child to Bharatnatyam lessons. And he found that there was one teacher in the locality who did 30 minutes of Bollywood plus 30 minutes of Bharatnatyam. So he took that option. He said, if you get an opportunity to do Bharatanatyam here in the UK, then why not? She should not be at a disadvantage because she is not in India. And the example of Bharatanatyam is really telling, because Bharatanatyam, as some of you might know, has its origins in the temple dance in southern Indian state of Tamil Nadu, where until 1920s, this dance form was an exclusive reserve for hereditary courtesans, so Devadasis affiliated to Hindu shrines. So after the Devadasi system was banned in 1947, this dance was then delinked from its ritual function in temples and rebranded as Bharatanatyam and began to be performed by urban educated women. And the social background of these new practitioners was seen to kind of quote unquote purify the dance and make it a respectable form of classical art that middle class, upper caste families like Mahesh's came to embrace, and where it is still practiced largely by women. So, and since then, Bharatanatyam has really spread across India and the diaspora, becoming synonymous with Indian culture and performing arts. So this historical trajectory of Bharatanatyam sort of gives us a sense of how some of those traditions, which are seen as timeless and rooted in ethnic identities, are actually subject to social change and are historically constituted by currents of caste, class, and gender. But what we also get from this narrative is around flexibility about what you can get and what you want to get, and sort of mixing and matching. So Mahesh also sends his daughter to Sanskrit lessons. So his family would actually, their cultural heritage is around Malayalam, but there are no Malayalam lessons available in where he lives, just outside London, but there are Sanskrit lessons available. So he says that's the next best thing available. So why not send there? She would get some idea of the Hindu cultural background that he wants his daughter to learn about. So therefore, these parents are drawing on their class resources. They're spending their money using their social networks to enroll their children into the specific ethnic leisure lessons through which they seek to transmit this kind of ethnic cultural capital. And by ethnic cultural capital, I really draw on the works of P.G. Land, the Taiwanese sociologist, who talks about ethnic cultural capital as a process rather than as an entity. So it's not something that you possess as a static thing, but it's a dynamic process of cultural negotiation in which immigrant parents selectively mobilize their cultural heritages and sometimes mix and match with values and practices in the new country. So it's not a static thing that you just bring over from somewhere and recreate, but it's something that you negotiate with both an imagined past and an homeland, but also in your current context. And where your class identities, the kind of class resources you have, your economic resources, play a role. Another way of looking at the kind of efforts that these parents are making to make sure that the children learn heritage languages, that the children have some of these cultural competencies, is to think about it, as a way for their children to develop positive appreciation of their ethnic heritage and their ethnic identities. That's important for these parents, but also these skills around understanding of Indian languages, for example, can also help unlock certain avenues of transnational mobility for these children in their future, given the rise of India in the global economy. So having those skills might pay off even in a kind of in their professional life later on. So there are class dynamics involved in this kind of ethnic leisure spaces as well. So what I'm trying to really point out here is that these efforts are being made, and we really need to engage with how these parents are mobilizing their class resources for this kind of ethnic cultural kind of socialization of their children. And while doing so, we need to be attentive to a number of things. One, the fact that different diasporic communities, by which I mean different subnational diasporas, are positioned differently in terms of what kind of ethnic leisure activities are available around them. B, that there are questions of class involved in that this kind of middle class parents who have a certain amount of economic capital, certain amount of money and resources to spend are able to do so. And third, there are questions of gender and caste that are woven into what they assume or the kind of purport to be their cultural heritage. The other aspect, the other role that leisure plays in these families is around placemaking. And by placemaking, I mean the process through which space is imbued with symbolic meaning and transformed into a place. And this can range in different scales, from both at the level of large cities and large scale places, but also at a smaller scale, the microgeographies of placemaking. So leisure is often mobilized by diasporic people as a way of directing those placemaking processes. And these are significant because by creating those spaces, creating those places, in fact, of leisure, becomes a way of staking a claim, if you like, and asserting ethnic pride in their current context. And I'll give you a few examples of the placemaking practices where leisure becomes a vehicle for that, for placemaking in the diaspora. A more obvious example is around the Diwali on Trafalgar Square, which is an event that's held annually in Trafalgar Square. It's a day-long public celebration of Indian festival of Diwali, and it's supported by the Mayor of London's office. And it's been going on since 2001. The Diwali day, if you like, is determined by the Hindu lunar calendar, and therefore it is different every year, falling either in October or early November. And we have Diwali coming up in a couple of days. But notwithstanding the exact date of Diwali as per the lunar movement, the Diwali on Trafalgar Square is organized on a Sunday within a few weeks of the actual Diwali. So you can already see that idea of adapting and kind of mixing and matching in the diaspora, the adjustments that are made. So this picture is actually courtesy to Time Out London. But these kind of, so on the day of the Diwali on Trafalgar Square, what happens is that the entire Trafalgar Square space is kind of reinscribed, if you like, as an Indian cultural space. And on one end of the square, it hosts a temporary stage, while on the other side, where the steps are, as you can see, to National Gallery, it is flanked by rows of makeshift stalls selling Indian snacks and sweets, natural medicines, meditation kits, charity coupons, to name just a few. And during my visit to these celebrations, I would see that children were quite instrumental in the narrative that the organizers were trying to present. So a group of children of Indian heritage took to the steps of Trafalgar Square and really broke out on a series of choreographed dance performances which narrated the story behind Diwali. And at the other side of the steps in the stage, there were great many performances, mostly to Bollywood music, that were put up as a way of articulating that Indian cultural heritage and the kind of Indian cultural products. So what, in terms of thinking about this Trafalgar Square and the way the Diwali celebrations happen, we can see a number of processes around leisure that's taking place. So Trafalgar Square, which is really emblematic of the white British military pride with Nelson's column standing in the middle of the public square, this one-day event reinscribes that white colonial space of Trafalgar Square and transforms it, however momentarily, into a vehicle for the assertion of cultural pride by racialized minorities like British Indians. So through this festival and the live performances, these diasporic subjects engage in placemaking. And by channeling their cultural heritage, especially intangible cultural heritage, through performing arts, British Indians were able to direct placemaking at the heart of really a super diverse London. Moreover, by lending greater visibility to their both physical and non-physical expressive culture, Indian diasporans forge a multi-ethnic sense of belonging. The organization of the festival at this scale draws upon the effort of British Indians, mostly Gujaratis and North Indian heritage. And in turn, the festival brings together and facilitates the expansion of these diasporic networks. These occasionally produced festival spaces also generate claims that diasporic groups advance for greater recognition and preservation of their cultural heritage. In mobilizing these resources, these festivals as diaspora's place-making exercise also fulfill an important educational role in the sense that they help non-Indian Londoners to appreciate Indian cultural expressions. But while appreciating this role it plays in lending greater visibility to Indian cultural expressions, one also needs to be aware of the internal divisions within the diaspora that these spaces throw into relief. For example, the particular cultural expressions found within the DOTS platform are tied to Gujarati and North Indian communities, evidenced in the use of Hindi and Gujarati music, as well as the performance of a grand garba, which is a kind of circular form of dance quite popular in Gujarat, which is the epicenter of the celebration. So in purporting to reproduce and showcase an authentic Indian culture at the heart of London, this festival produces a particular upper caste, middle class, Northwest Indian assemblage of tangible and intangible heritage. And of course, there is also convergence of corporate interest who sponsor these events. So these kinds of mega events around leisure that take place, around festivals especially, that take place at public places, have an important role to play in negotiating ethnic identities in the diaspora. Similarly, the Durga Puja celebrations, which are done mostly by Hindu Bengalis at a much smaller scale in indoor community centers. But even there, one sees that the afterlives of caste, if you like, because most of the organizers are upper caste, middle class, Hindu Bengalis. And some of the religious activities around it are still kind of reflect the caste privileges that are inherent in their, that are inherent and kind of, and those caste privileges are activated during these festivals because the people who have the right to perform the worship and right to do certain things had to be Brahmins. So those elements of caste do not go away, but are kind of activated during these festival days as well. But at a more smaller scale, within the family, within the home, there are other kinds of place-making practices evident where leisure and the nexus of leisure and culture is visible. So this is a picture that one of my participants, an 8-year-old girl, Jasleen, drew about her watching films, Indian films, in their living room. So Indian films appear as a very important aspect where parents and children, by consuming those filmic narratives, are also creating shared memories, memories that link to their parents' childhoods as well as to their own. So here Jasleen talks about, I like watching movies with my family because some movies make me laugh and my family laughs and we have a good time. And Alpesh, who kind of grew up in the UK and has children of his own, now talks about how Indian movies takes him back to his own childhood. He talks about how every Saturday and Sunday, me and my parents and my sister would watch Indian movies. So just growing up, that's what I know. I know the old movies and the new ones. And they often share those experiences with their own children now. So kind of this watching films together as a family produces a kind of a diasporic space where kind of existing ideas are circulated, new forms of memories are created, and which link back to a diasporic past as well as to the diasporic present. And around religion, of course, there are some forms of worship, some form of festivals which are organized within the home. Like Aparna, who is Bengali, who has an MBA but is now a housewife. She talks about, I don't have a puja room or a shrine in my house. I don't do prayers, but I do Saraswati Puja, which is a worship of the goddess of learning, prevalent especially in Bengal, so that my daughter gets exposure to the culture, you know. So this idea of giving exposure to the culture is really key in driving these parents to create those festival spaces within the home, even if they do not practice religion. So really to think about some of these issues gives us a good sense of how important leisure spaces are as vehicles for diasporic parents to transmit those cultural heritage, but also for them to negotiate their visibility, negotiate their claim with the mainstream British society. Now, I'll just end with a bit of some preliminary ideas about some of the impact that COVID-19 has had on these kind of festival spaces, because of the current pandemic, in-depth mass gathering can no longer be organized. So as a result, what has happened is that many of these festival organizers have adapted to the situation, and what they have done for Durga Puja, for example, and for Navaratri is that they're staging small-scale indoor events, mostly within the house of the organizer, and then live streaming it on websites and Facebook groups for the other community members to join in. So, of course, the pandemic has impacted the way this kind of collective leisure spaces, the possibilities of collective leisure spaces really, but they have not substituted them. So diasporans continue to engage in some of these festivals, but there is now they're being articulated on digital spaces and environments. And so this is a project that I'm currently engaged in, and hopefully I'll be able to share more about it as the festival season progresses, with Diwali coming up. So to wrap up some of the concluding thoughts around the project that I have been engaged in around leisure and diaspora is I really want us to engage more with how race, ethnicity, and class interrelate and kind of play out within these diasporic leisure spaces, how parents mobilize class resources for ethnic and racial socialization of children, as well as to negotiate their way around the mainstream society as such. And on the other hand, something that often gets sidestepped is the heterogeneity of the diaspora itself. So some subnational diasporas, due to historical reasons, have wider networks and infrastructure in the UK. As I gave the example of Punjabi language lessons, it's relatively easier to find Punjabi or Gujarati language lessons for children to do than it is, say, to do a Tamil lesson. So there are kind of different histories of subnational diasporas, and therefore different subnational diasporas are positioned slightly differently in terms of what they can or cannot access within the UK. But also in terms of thinking about caste privileges, especially within festival spaces, within religious spaces, is important, and how that kind of fractures the diasporic geography. And lastly, around how the pandemic has created new affordances where this middle-class, globally connected diaspora are able to reinscribe existing processes of placemaking and community building in online spaces. And what comes of it will be really, really interesting to see in the future. So I'll end it there, and I'll be more than happy to answer questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Utsa. That was very insightful and inspiring presentation. And I think, some of the things that are really happening around us, I think you have really portrayed it, and particularly that digital ethnography that you've mentioned, and drawings and so on. So I think these are really very interesting, and I'm sure that our colleagues, for example, Valentina, who's from Winchester School of Arts, will be very interested in what you're doing. Bindi Shah, Dr. Bindi Shah, who's at the sociology, she would be really, and there are many other colleagues like, Professor Paru Shukla from, so these are all people who are really, understanding these kind of different, how societies evolve, and in terms of the communications and so on. So I think there are lots of questions. I have a number of questions, but I think I would like to really hand over the questions to the audience. I think whoever wants to really ask a question, please do ask a question, and please switch on your video and microphone. I think well, let's make it interactive because it's a small group. Yes, Bindi, or Professor Sri, do you want to start? Because I see that you have a question right up there.
Yes, I think the present. Thank you first of all, Utsa, for making time to come and share your study, your research. So thank you on all our behalf. To me, after your presentation, I'm left with more questions than answers and observations. So that is good because you summed up in the last slide, things to explore. So I won't go into that. That's good. I was just thinking the concept, there are 2-3 things really. Is there a sort of a little bit of tension between the words culture and leisure? And I'm still trying to get my head around that, and I can't work it out. I don't know what made you to start with that. Then the word placemaking, which is quite a powerful word. And I thought placemaking, is that unique? Because even if you like, take it the public school system in England, I mean, that's what they do, eat and eat and eat, and how many prime ministers, and even Rishi Sunak, is a byproduct of that, without complicating. So I'm not, again, I'm trying to work it out. Is that something unique to us? I'm not so sure about that. That's going on. That's part of human nature. I want my son to do this, daughter to do that. So I'm struggling. And the other one I asked myself maybe to ask, would say, is you use the word Indian, as I think you almost said. Are you trying to cover a broad canvas, and maybe you need to narrow it down a bit more, which I think, again, you mentioned that in the last slide. So I'm not trying to tell you what to do, but I think it's so many questions in there, but I think it's quite nice to stimulate and, ask a few questions really. So thank you for that. It helps. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you, Sri. Please, so you may please respond.
Really very pertinent questions. Thank you very much for them. So I'll try and sort of tackle them one by one. So one, in terms of relation between culture and leisure. Yes, so if you think of leisure, I was thinking of leisure there really kind of as practices. The leisure as everyday practices of both in terms of time and space, and culture as something more embodied and processual. So there are, of course, they meet each other at spaces, but so one can partake in various kinds of leisure activities. And there are particular intersections of where your kind of embodied sense of cultural identity and your leisure activities meet. And that's where I was really trying to, that those spaces are those intersections where I was trying to capture. In terms of placemaking, yes, placemaking is not unique to any individual or group. It is something that we partake in all the time, everywhere, and everyone does it. But what I was trying to focus on here is how specific kind of ethnic placemaking take place, and how leisure becomes a vehicle, if you like, to direct that kind of ethnic placemaking. And looking at ethnic placemaking in particular is important because that gives us a sense of how ethnic minorities try to make their particular cultural heritage visible, so that that placemaking practice becomes political in a way that has implications for thinking about multiculturalism, for intercultural kind of mutual education, really, of how Indians negotiate the public space with others in a multi-ethnic society. But also in terms of its internal politics, who gets to make the place, who gets to direct placemaking, and for what purposes, and who are excluded from that process. So those are important questions, I think, to explore. And yes, Indian as a category is quite broad, and that is one of the things that I'm really interested in unpacking, is because the Indian diaspora studies as a body of literature often speaks of and for Indian diaspora. So does the Indian government's initiatives which are quite kind of broad brush Indian diaspora initiatives. But even within a middle class Indian diasporic community, there are those internal fissures around regional, religious kind of differences, as well as questions of gender and caste. So I think it's important to begin with the broad brush and then try to figure out how that category is kind of internally differentiated. What are the kind of factors that differentiate it, and how those internal differences then matter in terms of the public understanding of the diaspora. And again, this is implications for thinking about diaspora policies as well. So yeah, so thank you for the question, and I agree with you that it is a broad category, but we need to unpack it and deconstruct it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Utsa. That was Professor Srikandeya from Business School, who's really worked in communities, is a community champion of the whole of Hampshire. So now let's move on to Dr. Bindi Shah. Bindi, please switch on the microphone, and also you can switch on the video if you prefer. There we go. Nice.
Hi everyone. Hi Utsa. Nice to meet you finally. I apologize. I've got 3 minutes because I've got to go to another meeting. So I will pose my questions and then we'll probably have to leave. So sorry about that. Fascinating talk. It's been very interesting to hear about your PhD research, and hope to hear more about your new project as well, about the online religious activities. My question actually relates to the point that you made in response to Shree's questions about placemaking. In your talk, you talk about the internal politics and the internal divisions in terms of ethnicity, caste, and class, and who gets to make place, particularly in the public spaces and things like that. But I was going to ask, and I'm sure you've done this, and perhaps didn't have time to talk about it, but what is the role of multicultural policies in Britain that facilitates this kind of placemaking amongst established ethnic minority communities? So, that's something to consider. I'm sure you've considered it, but to have a discussion on. And the other thing that I was really quite interested in, and this relates to our Pioneers project in some ways, is also what did you find a difference between middle-class families who were, say, second generation already here, so brought up in the UK, and those who might have come in the last 10, 15 years on high-skill visas and things like that, but have been here for about 10, 15 years and have had children. Did you find differences in their strategies for cultural and social reproduction, or was your sample too small, and that's perhaps a bigger study, a follow-up study later on? So I'm going to be here for a minute and then probably leave. So sorry about that, and we can have other opportunities, I'm sure, to talk.
Yeah, thank you. Those are really, really great questions. So I'll start with the second question first, if you like. So differences in terms of, in terms of migration history, yes, very much so. And my sample really included, I think there were 6 parents who were born in the UK, and the others were more recent migrants who have now become British citizens. But some of the biggest differences between their strategies was in terms of, was their own points of reference. So for the UK-born parents, the point of reference was their own British Indian childhood, experiences of racism, how kind of banding together with cousins and other Indian kind of friends that they had was kind of part of their leisure lives. And they're also, most importantly, these UK-born Indian parents have also experienced social mobility in their lifetime, because most of them had parents who would either run like corner shops or worked in factories. So they had, and then now they are kind of very high earning middle class professionals. So that social trajectory that they have had in terms of their class position is different from this highly skilled visa-holding Indians who have come over in the last 15 to 20 years and are now British citizens, because those parents grew up in largely privileged urban centers in India. They are all sort of English educated. They had that kind of privilege while growing up. But also their points of reference are their Indian childhoods, which are of course characteristically different. So those points of reference are different, and also the kind of resources they can draw on in terms of social networks. Indian parents do not have their own parents in this country. They do not have those links, those kind of community networks that UK-born parents have. UK-born parents often get help from their own parents in terms of childcare, for example, that India-born parents don't. So these are some of the factors that then play a role in what and how the parents are able to sort of engineer leisure strategies for their children. In terms of multicultural policies, yes, there are kind of, and it requires unpacking more, because as I was saying, the Diwali festival in Trafalgar Square is one of those kind of very visible and very kind of archetypal sort of instance of that kind of the mayor's office sponsoring that event and it being seen as the emblem of Indian cultural kind of festival. And of course, the Prime Minister and so on would come and give a little speech about Diwali on their official channels. So those kind of narratives then, as a kind of byproduct, end up privileging certain forms of cultural festivals over others. And those cultural festivals, more often than not, are the ones that are associated with middle class and very much upper caste cultural practices in India. So yes, but again, I'm just giving you a very short answer here. But yes, multicultural policies do create affordances for certain forms of placemaking to be more to be deemed more legitimate than others, while others are seen as problems and so on.
Thank you, Utsa. So, any other questions from the audience? Any further questions? Anyone? Right. So I think I would just like to really conclude by asking a question that's regarding, you know, we talk about integration, right? Community integration. So did you explore that component? Like, for instance, you know, children integrating with other, you know, kind of communities, like, you know, that also includes local British children and other. So how do they spend? Because the leisure is actually quite broad, and these days probably people are more digitally connected. But did you find any kind of evidence from your study? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Seems to have frozen, I think.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Yes, sorry, I thought I was frozen. No, that's a very important dimension, really. And yeah, so to begin with, yes, most of the children go to schools which are quite multi-ethnic, and again, because they live in and around London, London is what we call super diverse. There are diversities in every aspect of social life that they encounter. But there are two things that happen in that sense. One is, of course, they're having to negotiate their cultural identity in a multi-ethnic, multicultural context, but also experiences of racism that children face. Often those are in leisure spaces. For example, I have had children tell me about experiences in playgrounds where they would be called, oh, Asians are smelly and so on. And children stand up to it, and they're like 8 to 12-year-old children, so they're quite young. So experiences of racism. One child was sort of with a family going around in a kind of in a shopping complex having a day out, and she was kind of playing with other white children, and she was called poo-faced. And so these kind of instances of racism then become talking points within the home in terms of the parents trying to reinforce that kind of cultural pride, but also talking to them about racism, how to deal with it, and so forth.
Right.
Those aspects of sort of social integration, or even kind of multi-ethnic kind of encounter, that play out in leisure spaces. And another way of looking at it is kind of how Indian cultural practices or family practices are remade as a result of this living together with difference, if you like. So many of these families now who'd never put up Christmas trees when before are now doing it for their children, and there are those kind of syncretism happening. They would celebrate Christmas and Diwali with kind of equal fervor. So they're not losing something to gain something, but they are kind of integrating things and making it new, personalizing, if you like, family practices. And there are those imprints of their external environment in their internal practices, if that makes sense. So it's happening both ways.
Right. That's very, that on that note, I think on the festivals, I think, we have Diwali and also Christmas coming. I think, on behalf of the India Center, we'd like to really thank you for this wonderful presentation. I know that, the timing is not really perfect, but our aim was actually to also relay this to other countries, like, for example, India and a few other, like Bangladesh, Pakistan, whatever, so that this body of knowledge can be shared and so on. But despite that, I think, you gave us a lot of insights regarding the sociology of childhood. I mean, especially among ethnic communities in the UK, so in England and Wales, particularly on. So we are very grateful to you for that, and we wish you all the best, and we hope to really continue engaging with you in the future. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you everyone for taking your time and coming to this meeting. And this meeting is recorded, and the recorded version will be made available at some point on the website. Thank you all, and please stay safe. Thank you, and good afternoon.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.